Is salvation a purely monergistic action of God from start to finish? Or do we as humans play a role in any sense in our salvation? Now, this question is very contentious. A lot of people are either on one side or the other, and the people who hold to these sides in a very dogmatic way get very angry with the other side. Those who are monergists feel like any sort of synergy would disrupt the glory and honor of salvation belonging totally to God. And those who are synergists feel as though the monergists are robbing humans of their design as creatures with wills that God has created to cooperate with His grace. So the way that I come down on this is really on both sides, ultimately. I believe that salvation is both a monergistic and synergistic work. I believe that the saving is a monergistic work, but I do believe that we as humans, we play a role in that process. So if we're defining synergy as God does a little something and I do a little something, I reject that completely. It's not about me doing something and God doing something and us conjoining our efforts to save me, the sinner. So if that's your definition of synergy, I reject that completely. However, if your definition of monergism is that God saves the sinner and the sinner in no way, shape, or form needs to cooperate with the grace of God, then I also have a critique of that position as well. I think the first thing that needs to be discussed is a distinction between the initial moment of salvation or justification, as it is commonly called, and then the process of sanctification, which leads to glorification. And I think that so many people focus on justification that they forget about sanctification, and they forget that justification and sanctification are tied together in many respects. If somebody is justified, the process of sanctification is already happening in that person's life. And if somebody is being sanctified, it's only because they have been declared right before God. And so I don't want to put too large of a distinction between them, especially because I don't believe Paul does. Now, with that being said, what do I mean by it's both a monergistic work of God and also synergism as well? Here's what I mean. If I am living my life outside of Christ, and I all of a sudden place my faith and my trust in Christ, the only factor, listen to me very closely, all you Calvinists watching, the only factor at play in bringing me from death to life is an action of God. Not me whatsoever. I can contribute nothing to that. I can't even will myself to say yes as a hard-hearted sinner. So the moment of conversion, or the process of regeneration, when we get to the moment of putting faith in Jesus Christ, the only thing that is a factor at play there is a work of God's grace in the human life, which enables me to then freely respond yes. Apart from that grace, nothing. Now, where do we go from there? I would say that is a very pure definition of monergism, is recognizing that we can do nothing. Now, the Arminians and the Provisionists, the Pelagians, they would all say something very different than that. And so I am well within the realm of Augustinian soteriology when I say it is an act of God. And I think I would get a lot of agreement with that. Now, the part that I might not get as much agreement with is the idea of after that justification, as we're being sanctified by God, it's God's grace that sanctifies us. It's not us that does any of the good that comes out of our salvation. We're not working as hard as we can. We are now living out the reality that's been worked in. We are working out our salvation with fear and trembling. But right there, that verse that I just quoted, that right there indicates that we have a synergistic role to play. We are called to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. We are called to walk by the Spirit. If we live by the Spirit, walk by the Spirit, we are called to persevere. We are called to hold fast to the confession of faith. And so obviously, how do we do this? How do we do any of it? We do it with the grace of God. We do it with the grace of God. However, there is a possibility for somebody to reject that grace and fall away. The scriptures are very clear on this. There are those who are enlightened, who tasted in the heavenly gift, who partook of the Spirit, who were sanctified, Hebrews tells us, who fell away from the faith. Paul tells us that if we have unbelief in us, we can be cut off. Christ gives a parable about those who receive the gospel with joy and believe for a while, but later fall away. So the Bible is very clear that it is possible to resist this grace, which is why I say that there is a cooperation involved. Now, this cooperation is fully dependent on God's grace. If God removed his grace, we wouldn't be able to cooperate with anything, because there would be nothing to sustain us and we would be damned. We would be lost. But if God's grace is present and we are cooperating with that grace, then God is carrying us from start all the way to finish. We can say no to that grace. We can walk away from that grace. But that grace is the very means by which we live the Christian life. And so in that sense, it is a monergistic work. We are not contributing anything to our standing, to our continuing, to our completion. All we are doing is cooperating with the grace of God, and that cooperation is only possible because of the grace of God. So I hope I'm making clear that synergism is not a God does a bit and I do a bit, God does a bit, I do a bit. I'm defining synergism in a sense that I am working out my salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is working within me. And I cannot ignore the countless passages that teach that we can fall away from the faith, and so it's my job to endure, and I can only endure with God's grace, and there's this kind of merging of two different things: the call for me to endure and the ability, and knowing that the ability to endure is only possible with God's grace. And that's what I mean by synergy. Two things coming together as one that cannot be separated from one another. I can't endure without the grace of God, and God's grace can't endure me if he hasn't given me the grace. And so there's this marrying and merging of these two realities, the human will and the will of God, merging together in a beautiful, perfect harmony as God perfects us and sanctifies us and brings us to glorification. And so I think that we can oftentimes become too dogmatic about terminology, terms like monergism or synergism. And you can hear people that really just, they trash the synergists because you guys just don't care about the glory of God. But then on the other side, you have those that would trash the monergists and say that you're not acknowledging the role of humans. And to a certain extent, I would say that both sides need to simmer down and recognize that in many ways we're looking at two sides of the same coin, right? I would say that the synergists tend to look at the tails, and the monergists tend to look at the heads. The heads represents God's perspective, the tails represent man's perspective. And we look at both of those things, and we're trying to pick which one is true, when in reality it's something kind of right down the middle. And if I pick up a coin and I try to look at both sides at the same time, I can't do it. I can't look at both sides at the same time. And if I turn it sideways, it basically disappears. It's a reality that I can't quite fully understand. How is God's sovereignty and my will coming together in this beautiful harmony where I'm called into action to work out my salvation, to endure to the end, to be faithful, to keep persevering, to believe, to trust, to hold steadfast? How is that true? While also recognizing that it is God who accomplishes those things within me. I'm not sure exactly how to work that out, but what I do know is that diminishing the human will in salvation really minimizes the beauty of God working and accomplishing exactly what he has planned to, even with a human that has a will that can resist him. I think that that's a beautiful mystery, and I think that if we say, well, no, it's impossible. If God's going to do this and this, then the human can't have a will to resist him. Well, we're limiting God then. We're limiting the scope of his sovereignty. At the end of the day, there's nobody in hell that is going to be there because God put them there and because they somehow missed out a good opportunity, and God's going to be scratching his head going, how did they get there, man? That wasn't how it was supposed to go. And there's nobody who's going to be in heaven that God's going to be like, oh, whoa, I thought you were headed there for sure. I mean, man, glad you're here, but I didn't see that coming. No, God infallibly, before the world began, he made a decree, and that decree included who would be of the saved. And we don't know who those people are. We don't know any of that. But what we do know is that that decree is infallible and will come to pass. And yet, it does not come to pass because God has determined every action of man. It comes to pass through God's grace working in the hearts of free men with free choices who choose to accept that grace or reject that grace. And I don't know how that all works, but I do know that God's plan will be perfectly brought to fruition regardless.